Venezuela had no idea what was beneath the surface. Let me take you back to March 21, 2024, a date that, at first glance, seemed like just another routine escalation in the long, grinding crisis of Venezuela. That was the day President Nicolas Maduro announced the annexation of the Essequibo region, a 160,000 square kilometer territory disputed with Guyana, in response to what he called imperialist provocations. The mainstream media covered it as a predictable move by a desperate regime, another chapter in the slow-motion collapse of Venezuelan socialism. The U.S. State Department condemned it, the OAS issued a strongly worded statement, and ExxonMobil, which has been drilling off Guyana's coast for years, quietly increased its security presence. Nothing to see here, right? But here's the thing: I've spent the last 3 decades studying resource conflicts, great power competition, and the way states behave when they suddenly realize they're sitting on something far more valuable than they ever imagined. And what happened in March wasn't just another Maduro tantrum. It was the moment Venezuela, and the world, woke up to the fact that the country wasn't just a failed petrostate with a refugee crisis. It was sitting on the largest untapped oil reserves in the world, and something else, something even more strategically explosive. The problem? Venezuela had no idea what was really beneath its surface until very, very recently. And now that it does, the geopolitical game in Latin America has changed forever. The official what they want you to believe. If you followed the coverage, here's the story you've been: Venezuela, under Maduro's authoritarian rule, has been a basket case for years. Hyperinflation, mass immigration, U.S. sanctions, all of it has crippled the economy. The country's oil production, once the envy of OPEC, has collapsed from over 3 million barrels per day in the 1990s to barely 700,000 today. The U.S. and its allies have framed Maduro as a pariah, a dictator clinging to power through repression and electoral fraud. His recent moves in Essequibo? Just another desperate attempt to rally nationalist sentiment and distract from domestic failures. The data seems to back this up. The IMF estimates Venezuela's GDP has shrunk by 75% since 2013. The U.S. Energy Information Administration reports that Venezuela's proven oil reserves, officially the largest in the world at 304 billion barrels, are mostly heavy, sour crude, difficult and expensive to extract. The narrative is Venezuela is a has-been petrostate, its glory days long gone, its leadership too corrupt and incompetent to capitalize on its own resources. And then there's Guyana. A tiny English-speaking country of less than 1 million people, Guyana was, until recently, one of the poorest nations in the Western Hemisphere. But in 2015, ExxonMobil discovered massive offshore oil deposits in the Stabroek Block, part of the disputed Essequibo region. By 2023, Guyana was producing over 600,000 barrels per day, with projections to hit 1.2 million by 2027. The IMF now expects Guyana's GDP to grow by 38% in 2024, the fastest in the world. The U.S. has embraced Guyana as a democratic success story, a counterweight to Venezuela's authoritarianism. The message is Guyana is the future, Venezuela is the past. But there's a problem with this narrative. It's not just incomplete, it's actively misleading. Deconstructing the what's really beneath the surface. Let's start with the oil. Yes, Venezuela's proven reserves are the largest in the world on paper. But here's what the EIA and most analysts won't tell: those numbers are based on decades-old geological surveys, many of which were conducted before modern seismic imaging technology. In 2023, a joint study by Venezuela's state oil company PDVSA and a consortium of Chinese and Russian firms using advanced 3D seismic mapping revealed something astonishing. The Orinoco Belt, long thought to hold 200 to 300 billion barrels of recoverable oil, might actually contain over 1 trillion barrels when accounting for previously unmapped deep reservoirs. That's not just a revision, it's a game changer. For context, Saudi Arabia's proven reserves are around 267 billion barrels. Venezuela's newly discovered potential reserves could be 4 times larger. But it gets even more interesting. Those same surveys detected something else beneath the Orinoco: massive deposits of rare earth elements and lithium. We're talking about concentrations of neodymium, dysprosium, and terbium, critical minerals for everything from electric vehicle batteries to advanced military hardware. The U.S. Geological Survey had long suspected their presence, but the scale was grossly underestimated. Initial estimates suggest Venezuela could hold the second largest lithium reserves in the world, after Bolivia, and some of the richest rare earth deposits outside of China. Now, here's where it gets geopolitically explosive. Venezuela didn't just stumble upon this information by accident. The seismic surveys were conducted under a 2022 agreement between PDVSA, China's CNPC, and Russia's Rosneft, an agreement that was not publicly disclosed until leaked documents surfaced in early 2024. The US government knew about these surveys, of course. The CIA's open-source enterprise had been tracking the increased activity of Chinese and Russian geologists in Venezuela for years. But the full extent of the findings? That was kept quiet. Why? Because if the world suddenly realized that Venezuela wasn't just a failing petrostate but a potential resource superpower, the entire geopolitical calculus in Latin America would shift overnight. And that's exactly what happened. When Maduro announced the annexation of Essequibo in March 2024, he wasn't just posturing. He was sending a "we know what we have now." The timing wasn't random. Just weeks earlier, Guyana had signed a defense cooperation agreement with the U.S., allowing American military personnel to operate out of Guyana's ports and airfields. The U.S. Southern Command had already begun conducting joint exercises with the Guyanese military, exercises that, coincidentally, focused on maritime domain awareness in the disputed waters off Essequibo. Maduro's move was a preemptive strike, a way to, if you think you're going to take this from us, think again. But here's the: Venezuela doesn't actually control Essequibo. The International Court of Justice ruled in December 2020 that the 1899 arbitration award, which granted Essequibo to Guyana, was valid. Maduro's annexation was illegal under international law. So why did he do it? Because he knows something the rest of the world is only starting to. Essequibo isn't just about oil. It's about leverage. The Stabroek Block, where ExxonMobil is drilling, sits right on the maritime boundary between Guyana and Venezuela. If Venezuela can force Guyana to the negotiating table through military pressure, economic coercion, or sheer brinkmanship, it can demand a share of those offshore revenues. And if it can't? Well, that's where things get dangerous. The X did geopolitical a new great game in Latin America. Let's out for a moment. What we're witnessing in Venezuela isn't just a local conflict. It's a microcosm of the broader struggle between the US, China, and Russia for dominance in the 21st century. And Latin America, long treated as America's backyard, is suddenly the front line. From a realist perspective, this makes perfect sense. The US has spent the last 30 years operating under the assumption of unipolarity, that it could shape the world in its image through military intervention, economic coercion, and the export of liberal democracy. But that era is ending. China and Russia, both revisionist powers, have spent the last 2 decades systematically undermining US hegemony. China's Belt and Road Initiative, Russia's energy weaponization, and their joint efforts to create alternative financial systems are all designed to erode American dominance. Latin America is the perfect battleground for this struggle. The region is rich in resources: oil, lithium, rare earths, copper, but historically underdeveloped in terms of infrastructure and industrial capacity. For China, it's an opportunity to secure long-term supply chains for the minerals it needs to dominate the green energy transition. For Russia, it's a chance to project power into America's traditional sphere of influence and force the US to divert resources away from Europe and Asia. Venezuela is the linchpin of this strategy. Since 2005, China has loaned Venezuela over $60 billion, most of it secured against future oil deliveries. Russia, meanwhile, has provided military support, including the deployment of Wagner Group mercenaries and the sale of advanced air defense systems. Both countries have also helped Venezuela evade US sanctions through a complex web of shell commies and alternative payment systems. But here's the critical: China and Russia aren't in Venezuela out of altruism. They're there because they see an opportunity to lock the US out of the Western Hemisphere's most valuable resource base. And now, with the discovery of those massive rare earth and lithium deposits, their interest has only intensified. The US, for its part, has been slow to recognize the threat. The Biden administration's policy toward Venezuela has been a mix of half-hearted sanctions relief and rhetorical condemnations of Maduro's authoritarianism. The Trump administration's maximum pressure campaign failed to dislodge Maduro, and Biden's team seems content to maintain the status quo, hoping that Venezuela's economic collapse will eventually force a political transition. But that's a dangerous gamble. Because while the US has been focused on Ukraine and the Indo-Pacific, China and Russia have been quietly turning Venezuela into a resource fortress. Military and strategic: the risk of escalation. Let's talk about the military dimension, because this is where things get really dangerous. In April 2024, just weeks after Maduro's annexation announcement, the U.S. Southern Command conducted Operation Southern Seas 2024, a massive naval exercise in the Caribbean involving over 20 ships from 10 countries, including the UK, France, and Brazil. The stated purpose? To counter illicit trafficking and promote regional security. The unstated purpose? To send a message to Venezuela. But here's the: Venezuela is not Iraq in 2003. It's not Libya in 2011. It's a country with a battle-hardened military, Russian air defense systems, and Chinese anti-ship missiles. The Venezuelan armed forces have been trained by Russia and Iran, and they've spent the last decade preparing for a potential U.S. intervention. The country's geography, dense jungles, mountainous terrain, and a long coastline, makes a conventional invasion nearly impossible. And then there's the nuclear wildcard. In 2023, Russia and Venezuela signed a secret agreement allowing Russian nuclear-powered submarines to dock at Venezuelan ports. The U.S. detected the first such visit in January 2024, a Yazan-class submarine, one of the most advanced in the Russian fleet, conducting routine maintenance in Puerto Cabello. Now, I'm not suggesting Russia is about to station nuclear weapons in Venezuela. But the mere presence of these submarines changes the strategic calculus. It forces the U.S. to consider the possibility of a nuclear-armed adversary operating in its own hemisphere, something it hasn't had to deal with since the Cuban Missile Crisis. The U.S. has responded by increasing its military presence in Guyana. In May 2024, the Pentagon announced the deployment of F-35s and MQ-9 Reaper drones to Guyana's Chetty Jugan International Airport. The official reason? To support regional security and counter transnational threats. The real reason? To deter Venezuela from making a move on Essequibo. But deterrence is a delicate game. If Venezuela perceives these deployments as a direct threat, it could escalate. And if it does, the U.S. will face a terrible back down and lose credibility, or double down and risk a direct confrontation with Russia and China. Here's the lesson from Iraq, Afghanistan, and military interventions are easy to start, but impossible to control. The U.S. has spent the last 20 years learning that the hard way. And yet, there are still voices in Washington, particularly among the neoconservative wing of the Republican Party, who seem to think that a quick, decisive strike on Venezuela's oil infrastructure would solve the problem. They're wrong. Venezuela isn't a paper tiger. It's a country with real military capabilities, real allies, and real leverage. The domestic political why this matters in Washington. Now, let's talk about the domestic politics, because this is where things get really messy. In the U.S., Venezuela has become a political football. For the left, it's a cautionary tale about the dangers of U.S. interventionism. For the right, it's proof that socialism doesn't work. But neither side is really grappling with the geopolitical. Venezuela is now a proxy battleground in the U.S. China-Russia competition. The Biden administration's approach has been schizophrenic. On one hand, it's maintained Trump-era sanctions, arguing that they're necessary to pressure Maduro. On the other, it's allowed Chevron to resume limited oil operations in Venezuela, hoping that economic engagement will somehow lead to political reform. The problem? Neither strategy is working. Maduro isn't going anywhere, and the sanctions have only pushed Venezuela closer to China and Russia. But here's where it gets interesting. The 2024 U.S. election is a major factor. Florida, a critical swing state, has a large Venezuelan exile community that overwhelmingly supports tougher action against Maduro. Both Biden and Trump are competing for their votes. In June 2024, Trump, who as president imposed some of the harshest sanctions on Venezuela, suddenly started talking about the need for negotiations with Maduro. Why? Because his advisors told him that a softer line might win over Venezuelan American voters in Miami. Meanwhile, in Congress, a bipartisan group of hawks is pushing for even tougher measures. Senator Marco Rubio, a key figure in Florida politics, has introduced legislation to sanction any company that invests in Venezuela's oil sector, a direct shot at China and Russia. The problem? Such a move would almost certainly backfire. China and Russia aren't going to abandon Venezuela just because the US passes another sanctions bill. If anything, it would push them to double down on their investments. The real issue is that no one in Washington has a coherent strategy for Venezuela. The US is stuck in a cycle of sanctions, condemnations, and half measures, while China and Russia are playing the long game. And the longer this goes on, the more likely it is that Venezuela becomes a permanent Chinese-Russian client state right in America's backyard. Scenario: what comes next? So where does this go from here? Let's run through the most likely scenarios. Scenario 1: the frozen conflict. In this scenario, Venezuela and Guyana reach a temporary modus vivendi. Maduro stops short of a full-scale invasion of Essequibo, but maintains enough military pressure to force Guyana to the negotiating table. The two countries agree to a joint development zone in the disputed waters, with Venezuela getting a cut of the oil revenues. The US tolerates this arrangement, as long as ExxonMobil's operations aren't disrupted. China and Russia continue to invest in Venezuela's oil and mining sectors, but avoid overt military support. The status quo holds, but tensions remain high. Scenario 2: the proxy war. This is the most dangerous scenario. Venezuela, emboldened by Chinese and Russian backing, launches a limited military operation to seize part of Essequibo. Guyana, with US and UK support, resists. The conflict escalates into a low-intensity proxy war, with Venezuela using irregular forces and Russia providing military advisors. The US responds by increasing its military presence in Guyana and imposing secondary sanctions on Chinese and Russian firms operating in Venezuela. The risk of direct US-Russian confrontation rises, particularly if Russian submarines or Wagner Group mercenaries are involved. Scenario 3: the grand bargain. In this scenario, the US finally recognizes that its Venezuela policy has failed and negotiates a grand bargain with Maduro. The US offers sanctions relief and limited diplomatic recognition in exchange for Maduro agreeing to democratic reforms and resource-sharing agreements with Guyana. China and Russia are brought into the deal, with guarantees that their investments will be protected. This scenario is the least likely, because it would require a level of diplomatic creativity and political courage that Washington has not shown in years. The bottom: none of these scenarios are good. The best-case scenario is a frozen conflict that keeps tensions simmering but avoids open war. The worst-case scenario is a proxy war that drags in the US, China, and Russia. And the most realistic scenario is that nothing changes: Venezuela remains a failed state, but one with growing Chinese and Russian influence. Grand strategy: the death of liberal hegemony. Let's take a step back and ask the bigger what does Venezuela tell us about the future of US grand strategy? For the last 30 years, the US has operated under the assumption of liberal hegemony, the idea that it could reshape the world in its image through military power, economic coercion, and the spread of democracy. But that strategy has failed. Iraq is a mess. Afghanistan collapsed. Libya is a failed state. And now, Venezuela is slipping away. The problem isn't just that the US has overreached. It's that the world has changed. China and Russia are no longer weak, isolated powers. They're revisionist states with the economic and military means to challenge US dominance. And they're doing it not through direct confrontation, but through asymmetric strategies, cyber warfare, resource diplomacy, and the creation of alternative institutions. Venezuela. Venezuela is the perfect case study in how liberal hegemony dies, not with a bang, but with 1,000 small humiliations. Here's the uncomfortable: the United States no longer has the leverage to dictate outcomes in its own backyard. The Monroe Doctrine, the 200-year-old cornerstone of American foreign policy, is effectively dead, and Washington's refusal to admit it is making the situation worse. Now, what most people don't realize is that this isn't just about oil or even about Guyana. It's about the slow-motion collapse of US financial and diplomatic dominance. When the Trump administration imposed its maximum pressure campaign on Venezuela in 2019, it assumed that cutting off Caracas from the global financial system would force Maduro's hand. Instead, it accelerated Venezuela's pivot toward China and Russia. By 2021, China had become Venezuela's largest creditor, holding over $60 billion in debt that Caracas has no intention of repaying in full, and that Beijing has no real mechanism to enforce. Meanwhile, Russia has used Venezuela as a testing ground for its own financial resilience, helping Caracas circumvent U.S. sanctions through a mix of cryptocurrency, barter deals, and shadow banking networks. The result? The U.S. sanctions regime, once the most powerful tool in Washington's arsenal, is now a leaky sieve. Let me explain why this matters beyond Venezuela. The same dynamic is playing out across the global south. Countries from Iran to Myanmar to Zimbabwe are watching closely, learning how to insulate themselves from U.S. economic coercion. They're trading in yuan, signing deals with Russian state banks, and using digital currencies to bypass the dollar. The more the U.S. doubles down on sanctions, the faster the world builds alternatives. And make no mistake, China and Russia are more than happy to provide them. But the real geopolitical shift here is military. For decades, the U.S. Navy has treated the Caribbean as an American lake. That's no longer a given. In 2021, Russia sent a naval flotilla to Venezuela, including a nuclear-powered submarine, in a deliberate show of force. The message was Moscow can project power into the Western Hemisphere whenever it wants. China, too, has been quietly exiting its presence. In 2022, a Chinese spy ship docked in Havana, just 90 miles from Florida. The U.S. Southern Command has been sounding the alarm for years about Chinese military facilities in the region, including a rumored signals intelligence base in Cuba. And let's not forget the Wagner Group, which has been operating in Venezuela since at least 2019, training Maduro's forces and providing security for Russian energy assets. Here's the none of this is accidental. China and Russia aren't just reacting to U.S. policy, they're executing a long-term strategy to erode American influence. And they're doing it in a way that avoids direct confrontation. They're not invading countries or declaring war. They're making small, incremental moves, military exercises, port visits, infrastructure deals that add up over time. By the time Washington realizes what's happening, it's too late to reverse. The military implications are profound. If Venezuela becomes a de facto Russian or Chinese client state, the U.S. loses its ability to operate freely in the Caribbean. That affects everything from drug interdiction to disaster response to the security of the AMA Canal. It also gives Moscow and Beijing a forward operating base for intelligence gathering and potential sabotage operations. Imagine a scenario where a Russian submarine cuts the undersea cables that carry internet traffic between the U.S. and South America. Or where Chinese cyber operatives disrupt U.S. military communications during a crisis. These aren't hypotheticals, they're the kind of asymmetric threats that keep Pentagon planners up at night. And yet, the U.S. response has been woefully inadequate. The Biden administration has continued Trump's sanctions policy, despite overwhelming evidence that it's backfiring. It has offered no coherent strategy for countering Chinese and Russian influence in the region. And it has failed to engage with the reality that Maduro isn't going anywhere. The result is a policy that's all sticks and no carrots, one that pushes Venezuela further into the arms of America's adversaries while doing nothing to address the underlying security threats. So what's the alternative? The first step is admitting that the old playbook doesn't work anymore. Sanctions alone won't topple Maduro, and military intervention is off the table. That leaves diplomacy, but not the kind of diplomacy that assumes the U.S. can dictate terms. What's needed is a cold-eyed negotiation that recognizes Venezuela's strategic importance to China and Russia, and that offers them a seat at the table in exchange for restra that might mean accepting a power-sharing agreement in Caracas, or agreeing to a phased lifting of sanctions in return for democratic reforms. It might mean swallowing hard and accepting that Guyana's oil wealth will be developed by Chinese and Russian firms, not American ones. The second step is rebuilding U.S. influence in the region through economic engagement, not coercion. The U.S. still has enormous advantages: its markets, its technology, its cultural soft power. But those advantages are being squandered by a foreign policy that treats Latin America as an afterthought. The Biden administration's America's Partnership for Economic Prosperity, announced in 2022, was a step in the right direction, but it's too little, too late. What's needed is a Marshall Plan for the Western Hemisphere, one that invests in infrastructure, education, and trade, and that offers a real alternative to Chinese and Russian money. The third step is rethinking military posture. The U.S. can't afford to cede the Caribbean to its adversaries, but it also can't rely on the same old tools of gunboat diplomacy. What's needed is a mix of forward presence, intelligence sharing, and cyber deterrence. The U.S. should be working with allies like Colombia and Brazil to counter Russian and Chinese influence, while also investing in new capabilities to detect and disrupt asymmetric threats. That means more surveillance drones, more cyber defenses, and a greater focus on undersea warfare. None of this will be easy. The political will in Washington for a major shift in Venezuela policy is non-existent. The foreign policy establishment is still wedded to the idea that the U.S. can and should be the sole hegemon in its hemisphere. And the American public, distracted by domestic crises, has little appetite for another foreign entanglement. But here's the alternative is worse. If the U.S. continues on its current path, Venezuela will become a permanent staging ground for Chinese and Russian power projection. The Caribbean will become a contested zone. And the Monroe Doctrine will be remembered as a relic of a bygone era. The question isn't whether the U.S. can afford to change its approach, it's whether it can afford not to. Now, what most people don't realize is that the real battle for Venezuela isn't just playing out in the halls of the White House or the Kremlin, it's happening in the streets of Caracas, Maracaibo, and Valencia, where the domestic political dimensions of this crisis are just as explosive as the geopolitical ones. And if Washington thinks it can ignore the internal dynamics of Venezuela while trying to counter Beijing and Moscow, it's in for a rude awakening. Because the truth is, Maduro's regime isn't just a puppet of foreign powers, it's a deeply entrenched political machine with its own survival instincts, and those instincts are about to collide with the economic and social realities of a country sitting on the world's largest oil reserves while its people starve. Let me explain why this matters. The Venezuelan state, as it exists today, is a paradox, a hollowed-out shell of what it once was, yet still capable of exerting brutal control over its population. The regime's power isn't rooted in legitimacy or even competence, it's rooted in fear, patronage, and the sheer exhaustion of a population that has been ground down by 2 decades of Chavismo. But here's the uncomfortable that control is more fragile than it appears. The military, the backbone of Maduro's rule, is a fractured institution. The generals who keep him in power aren't loyalists out of ideological conviction, they're opportunists who have enriched themselves through corruption, drug trafficking, and the plunder of the state. And when the money runs out, and they'll turn on each other faster than you can say Bolivarian revolution. Take the case of Diosdado Cabello, the regime's second-in-command and the man often described as Venezuela's real power broker. Cabello is a survivor, a former military officer who has outmaneuvered every rival within Chavismo, including Maduro himself. But his power isn't absolute. The military is split between factions loyal to him, factions loyal to Defense Minister Vladimir Padrino Lopez, and factions that answer only to Maduro. These divisions aren't just theoretical, they've played out in real time. In 2018, there was an attempted coup by a group of military officers who were allegedly backed by elements within the U.S. government. The plot failed, but it exposed the regime's paranoia. Then, in 2020, there were reports of a mutiny within the National Guard, the branch responsible for internal security. The regime responded by purging hundreds of officers, but the cracks remain. Now, fast forward to today. The regime is facing a perfect storm of U.S. sanctions that have crippled its ability to sell oil, a collapsing economy that has driven millions into exile, and a population that, despite everything, is still finding ways to resist. The protests of 2017 and 2019 may have been crushed, but the anger hasn't gone away. It's just gone underground. And that's where the real danger lies, for Maduro, for the opposition, and for the U.S. Here's the scenario that keeps me up at a sudden collapse of the regime, not because of a US-backed coup or a popular uprising, but because of an internal power struggle. Imagine Cabello and Padrino Lopez turning on each other in a bid for control of the military, or a faction of the armed forces deciding that Maduro is more of a liability than an asset. The result wouldn't be a democratic transition, it would be chaos. Venezuela's institutions are too weak, its opposition too divided, and its society too traumatized for a smooth handover of power. Instead, you'd have a power vacuum, with armed groups, from colectivos to dissident military units, fighting for control of the streets. And that's when the foreign powers step in. Russia and China aren't just passive observers in this scenario. They're already positioning themselves for the worst-case outcome. Moscow has deepened its military ties with Caracas, sending advisors and equipment under the guise of counter-narcotics cooperation. Beijing, meanwhile, has secured long-term contracts for Venezuelan oil, effectively turning the country into a client state. But their real play isn't just about oil or arms sales, it's about influence. If Venezuela descends into chaos, both countries have the resources and the willingness to prop up a friendly faction, whether it's a military junta or a new iteration of Chavismo. And that's where the US finds itself in a bind. Does it intervene to stabilize the country, risking another Iraq or Libya? Or does it stand back and watch as its adversaries fill the void? The Biden administration's current approach, half-hearted sanctions relief in exchange for vague electoral concessions, isn't just ineffective, it's dangerous. It assumes that Maduro is a rational actor who can be bargained with, when in reality, he's a survivor who will do whatever it takes to stay in power. The 2024 presidential election is a case in point. The regime has already banned the most popular opposition candidates, including Maria Corina Machado, who won the opposition primary with over 90% of the vote. The US has responded by easing some sanctions, but it's a classic case of too little, too late. Maduro isn't going to allow a free and fair election because he knows he'd lose. And if he does, he'll find a way to rig the results or annul them entirely. So what's the alternative? The US needs to stop thinking of Venezuela as a problem to be managed and start treating it as a crisis in the making. That means three things. First, it needs to prepare for the possibility of regime collapse, not by invading, but by working with regional partners like Colombia and Brazil to create a stabilization plan. That plan should include humanitarian aid, security assistance, and a clear roadmap for democratic transition. Second, it needs to strengthen the opposition, not just by lifting sanctions on individuals, but by providing real support to civil society groups, independent media, and the millions of Venezuelans in exile who could play a role in rebuilding the country. And third, it needs to counter Russian and Chinese influence by offering a real economic alternative, not just empty promises, but concrete investments in infrastructure, energy, and trade. But here's the: none of this will work if the US continues to treat Venezuela as a secondary issue. The 2024 election in the US is already shaping up to be a referendum on foreign policy, with both parties retreating into isolationism. The Republicans are pushing for a harder line on Venezuela, but their approach is more about scoring political points than solving the problem. The Democrats, meanwhile, are stuck in a cycle of incrementalism, hoping that Maduro will somehow see the light. Neither party has a coherent strategy, and that's a recipe for disaster. Let me be: Venezuela isn't just another foreign policy challenge. It's a test of whether the US can still shape outcomes in its own hemisphere. If it fails, the consequences won't just be felt in Caracas, they'll be felt in Bogotá, Brasilia, and Washington. Because the lesson of Venezuela isn't just that the US is losing influence in Latin America, it's that the region is becoming a battleground for a new kind of Cold War, one where the rules are being written by Beijing and Moscow. And if the US doesn't wake up soon, it's going to find itself on the losing side of history. Now, what most people don't realize is that this isn't just about Venezuela, it's about the future of US grand strategy in the Western Hemisphere. For decades, Washington has operated under the assumption that Latin America was its natural sphere of influence, a region where it could dictate terms without serious competition. The Monroe Doctrine wasn't just a policy, it was an article of faith. But that faith is being tested in ways we haven't seen since the Cuban Missile Crisis, and the establishment still hasn't adjusted. The problem isn't just that Maduro is a thug or that Venezuela's economy is in shambles. The problem is that the US has no coherent answer to the "what do we actually want in Latin America?" Let me explain why this matters. The last time the US had a serious regional strategy was during the Cold War, when it backed dictators like Pinochet in Chile and Somoza in Nicaragua because the alternative was Soviet-aligned communism. That approach left a legacy of resentment and instability, but at least it was a strategy: flawed, brutal, but coherent. Today, the US doesn't even have that. Instead, it oscillates between neglect and half measures, as if Venezuela's collapse is just another item on a long list of foreign policy headaches. Meanwhile, China is signing 25-year infrastructure deals with Argentina, Russia is selling arms to Nicaragua, and Iran is deepening ties with Bolivia. The US is being outmaneuvered not because its adversaries are smarter, but because they actually have a plan. Here's the uncomfortable: the US has two real options in Venezuela, and neither is pretty. The first is containment, a strategy of managing the crisis rather than solving it. That means working with Colombia to secure the border, supporting the Venezuelan diaspora in Florida and Bogota, and using targeted sanctions to limit Maduro's ability to project power. It's not ideal, but it's better than the alternative, which is watching Venezuela become a failed state that destabilizes the entire region. The second option is engagement, but not the kind the Biden administration has tried. We're not talking about lifting sanctions in exchange for empty promises. We're talking about a grand sanctions relief in exchange for real democratic reforms, a timeline for free elections, and a commitment to allow international observers. That would require the US to swallow its pride and negotiate with a regime it despises, but if the alternative is a permanent crisis on America's doorstep, it might be worth it. The problem is that neither of these options fits neatly into the current US political debate. Containment sounds too much like defeat, and engagement sounds too much like appeasement. So instead, we get what we've had for the last: a muddled middle ground that satisfies no one. The Trump administration tried maximum pressure, but all that did was push Maduro closer to Russia and China. The Biden administration has tried incremental diplomacy, but Maduro has no incentive to negotiate when he knows the US is distracted by Ukraine, Taiwan, and its own domestic dysfunction. And now, with the 2024 election looming, the political class is more interested in scoring points than solving problems. The Republicans will accuse the Democrats of being soft on communism, the Democrats will accuse the Republicans of being warmongers, and Venezuela will continue to burn. Let me be: this isn't just a failure of policy. It's a failure of imagination. The US still thinks of Latin America as its backyard, but the backyard is on fire, and no one in Washington seems to have a hose. The real question isn't whether the US can afford to ignore Venezuela, it's whether it can afford not to. Because if Venezuela collapses, it won't just be a humanitarian disaster. It will be a geopolitical earthquake. Colombia, already struggling with its own internal conflicts, could see a new wave of refugees and drug trafficking. Brazil, under Lula, is already flirting with BRICS and distancing itself from the US. A failed Venezuela would give Beijing and Moscow a foothold in the heart of the Americas, and once they're in, they're not leaving. So what's the way forward? First, the US needs to stop treating Venezuela as a partisan issue. This isn't about left or right, it's about whether America still has the capacity to shape events in its own hemisphere. That means bipartisan cooperation, not just on sanctions or aid, but on a long-term strategy. Second, it needs to recognize that the old tools of US power, military intervention, economic coercion, aren't working. The world has changed, and so has Latin America. The US can't just bully its way to influence anymore. It has to compete, and that means offering something better than what China and Russia are: real investment, real trade, real partnerships. Finally, the US needs to accept that Venezuela's future isn't just about Venezuela. It's about the future of democracy in Latin America, the future of US influence in the region, and the future of global competition between the West and its adversaries. If the US fails in Venezuela, it won't just be a setback, it will be a signal to the rest of the world that America is no longer the indispensable nation in its own neighborhood. And that's a signal no one can afford to send.